So I just watched the brand new animated Garfield movie, starring Chris Pratt and Samuel L. Jackson. I cannot believe that those words just came out of my mouth. As you might guess by the title, I have some opinions about this film. But before I dive into the film itself, let's talk about the source material that this film is based on, and discuss whether the idea to make this movie was even a good one to begin with. Okay, so as most of you probably know, Garfield got his start as a comic strip character in local newspapers. I think it's fair to say that since his debut in 1978, he has become one of the most iconic characters in the world, with estimates suggesting his comics have been read by more than 200 million people worldwide. I mean, this cat is everywhere. He's got his own mugs, he's all over your grandma's Facebook page, he has his own Twitter. Here, let's go see what Garfield's been tweeting recently. Oh my gosh, what is that? It's horrifying! So that settles it. You can absolutely make a movie based on Garfield. The character is super popular, he has decades of comics to pull from. I mean, when you think about it, he's technically a comic book character, and those movies are doing pretty well right now. You'd think a Garfield movie would be a slam dunk. Oh, that's right. They already made a Garfield movie. No, I'm sorry. 2 Garfield movies, each of which are not very good, at least from what I've been told. I've definitely watched these movies at some point in my life, but I can't for the life of me remember anything that happens in them. Okay, but this movie isn't those movies, right? This movie isn't a live-action CGI hybrid abomination, so maybe that means it will be a more faithful adaptation. See, they have him posing on the poster the way he does in the comics. Side note, I actually hate this poster. If someone doesn't know who Garfield is, then it just looks like this poster says, "The Movie." I know I'm already nitpicking and we haven't even talked about the actual movie yet, so let's get into it. If you couldn't already tell how I feel about this movie based on the title of the video and the way I've been talking, I'm just gonna begin this review by saying that this movie is not good. It was actually shockingly bad. The beginning of the film isn't completely terrible. It's basically just Garfield eating a bunch of food and breaking the fourth wall, so at least they got that part of the character right. But that's where my compliments end, because this film genuinely fails at almost everything it tries to do. For one, this film feels the need to give Garfield a tragic backstory. Basically, his father abandons him, which leads him to John, who ends up taking him in. Speaking of John, Garfield is absolutely terrible to him in this movie, especially in the first few scenes. I know that in the comics, Garfield also isn't particularly kind to John either, but in this film, he seems like a psychopath who genuinely rejoices in John's misery. So much so that I assumed that it had to be intentional, and the writers were making Garfield super mean and unlikable so that they could have his character arc be him learning to treat John with more kindness. Or maybe they go the other way and give John a character arc where he learns to advocate for himself and be less of a pushover. Or better yet, maybe they would do both. Or they could just not do either of them. Yeah, that sounds about right. You see, those character arcs would have been great had the writers been interested in making a Garfield movie. Unfortunately, they weren't, and instead elected to make the most boring and generic movie possible. This movie doesn't even feel like a Garfield movie. It's just a run-of-the-mill kids film that just so happens to have Garfield characters. And they couldn't even do that right! A bunch of the main cast from the comics have little to no screen time in this movie. Instead, we get a bunch of random characters including Small Skinny Dog, Big Fat Dog, Evil Cat, a Depressed Bull, Snoop Dogg playing a cat, and of course, Garfield's father, Vic, whose character design is essentially Garfield but jacked? Okay. I don't know why this film felt the need to introduce so many random characters when it could have just stuck to the core cast. Garfield, John, and Odie, and maybe Nermal and Arlene. Rather than a plot that focuses on relationships the audience might actually care about, we get a film that focuses on Chris Pratt and Samuel L. Garfield and Vic's relationship. Okay, well maybe all these new characters will add to the story and help the film feel more unique. Nope. Despite the long list of characters, this film is extremely bare bones. I'm gonna do my best to avoid any major spoilers, but it hardly matters because if you watch the trailer, you can pretty much guess everything that is gonna happen. This movie is essentially cliche after cliche, and it gets really old really fast. The Garfield movie is just the story of Garfield learning to forgive his father for going out to get milk and abandoning him. You might think I'm joking when I say that, but I'm not. After abandoning Garfield, his dad literally joins a crew of criminal cats that specifically steal milk from different farms. I wish I was joking. It's just baffling to me that the whole plot of this movie centers on a character that has never been relevant to the Garfield franchise. If they really wanted a father and son dynamic, Why didn't they use the one they already have? They could have given the role of father figure to John. I think that would have been 10 times more interesting. But if they did that, then they wouldn't be able to advertise that this movie has Samuel L. Jackson as a cat in it. Okay, so let's say that we have to keep Garfield's dad in the movie. I still think they could have gone in a far more interesting direction with it. What if instead of this movie insisting that his dad isn't a bad guy, they leaned into the fact that he is a bad guy? What if instead of Garfield being angry with his father for leaving, he's just happy to have him back in his life, and he wants to be just like him, ignoring all the red flags surrounding him? I think that would be a far more compelling movie, because the whole film could build to Garfield realizing that he actually doesn't need to be like his father, and that he already has a great dad, John, a man who is loving and kind and doesn't want to rope Garfield into a life of crime. I just think that story is far more interesting than, oh yeah, Garfield's dad left him and never spoke to him for his entire life, but it's all okay because he wanted to talk to him, but was too scared. So instead, he secretly stalked him that entire time. Aw, how heartwarming. Like, hello? Am I the only one who thinks it's weird that this movie feels the need to desperately defend Vic at every turn and explain away all of the bad things he's done as unimportant misunderstandings? The fact that Vic is portrayed as this perfect father destroys all the potential there was to make him and Garfield's relationship nuanced and interesting. This movie wants you to be invested in their reconciliation, but doesn't want to do the work to make their dynamic compelling. So it just comes off as extremely hollow and boring. Speaking of things that are hollow and boring, this movie's attempts at comedy are embarrassing. There was one, maybe two jokes that made my face make anything close to even resembling a smile. The rest of the jokes were insufferable. First of all, most of them weren't even jokes, they were just Garfield smacking into various things. It's as if the writers were just too lazy to write actual jokes and just resorted to writing Garfield smacks against the floor, Garfield smashes against a wall, Garfield gets punched in the face, whenever they couldn't think of a joke. This movie also does a really annoying thing where whenever they do actually have a joke or a visual gag, the movie grinds to a screeching halt, and one of the characters explains why the joke was funny, which consequently ruins the joke and turns what could have been a funny scene into a tedious, unfunny one. One of the worst examples of this is like halfway through the movie when the Angry Bull character is comparing Garfield, Vic, and Odie to different animals and compares Garfield to roadkill. The joke isn't even that funny, but it's made 100 times worse by the fact that the scene just goes on and on and on. And they don't just do this with comedic scenes, they do it with the emotional scenes too. There's literally a line in this movie that happens right after a touching scene where a character interrupts and says, "I sense a positive breakthrough in your relationship." Another weak aspect of this movie is strangely the animation. To illustrate my point, take a look at the Peanuts movie. Now look at the Garfield movie. Why does a movie that came out in 2015 look far better than one released in 2024? Say what you want about the Peanuts movie, but you can't deny that they did a phenomenal job at translating these 2D characters into 3D characters. So yeah, I don't recommend this movie. The only reason I can imagine someone turning this on is if they're a parent and want something to entertain the kids for an hour and a half while they catch up on household chores or work or whatever. Even then, I can think of 20 other recent kids films that would be better than this. Films that don't insult their audience's intelligence and actually have better messages than this dumpster fire. And hey, if you want a kids film that still features Chris Pratt, then just turn on the Lego Movie. Or heck, turn on the Mario movie. It isn't perfect, but at least it doesn't feel completely devoid of life. I can already hear some of you saying, well, Isaac, did you really expect the animated children's film about a cat whose 3 personality traits are 1, that he loves lasagna, 2, that he's lazy, and 3, that he hates Mondays to be good? Yeah, I did. Okay, well, I should clarify that based on the trailers, I didn't expect this movie to be good. But I did want it to be good. Mainly because we've been given more than enough evidence proving that movies like this can be good. I'm sorry to bring up the Peanuts movie again, but it's similar to this film in the way that it's a modern animated movie based on an old comic. Except, in the Peanuts movie's case, it actually utilized its source material. I have a question for big movie studios. Is it really that unreasonable to expect movies that are given multi-million-dollar budgets to be good? Do companies like Sony not understand that if their movies were good, they would make more money? Oh, well, I guess they don't.